Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will get started in just another minute. Thanks for your patience as we start it up. And while you're all coming into the room, so I don't take any of Mr. Magnuson's time tonight, just want to let you know that the pop-up library is going to be at the Farmers Market on the Common tomorrow for Fall Fest. And that's going to run from 1 to 4. They've got lots of really excellent activities. The pop-up will be there from 1 to 3:30. We have a new mindfulness and meditation series starting up on Monday, October the 3rd. Lauren Massey of Mindful Minis Boston will take us through a nice 30-minute session starting on October 3rd and then on succeeding Mondays in October. If you sign up once, you get access to all of them. The traveling librarian is appropriately going to be in Transylvania in October, and that's going to be on Wednesday, October 5th. At 7 p.m. We have a new, Steve Hale has a new how-to class called Birding Without Binoculars. It's brand new. We're one of the first libraries to host it. So I hope you'll join us for that on Thursday, October 6th at 7 p.m. And then we have, as part of our AARP effort to promote Indigenous peoples and history and culture, we are co-hosting with the Tewksbury Library a virtual presentation by Heather Bruegel, and it's called The Forgotten Nations, Native Tribes of New England. And finally, a special Halloween event on Friday, October 14th at 2 p.m. We'll have the Salem Witch Museum online with us to present Witches Evolving Perceptions. You can sign up for all of those on our calendar or in the newsletter if you get that. If you don't get it already, please sign up on our website. But tonight we welcome back photographer Bruce Magnuson. After retiring from a career in financial services, Bruce has pursued his interest in photography, art, and history. He has photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various other venues, including the Chelmsford Library, and one featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. He has presented a wide variety of topics ranging from international affairs, social justice, art, photography, and the history of his home region, the Hudson River Valley, which we hosted not too long ago. Was it June? That was a really good presentation. I like that. Tonight, I'm very excited for this one. He will present his program on a new program called The Visions of the Shakers, a historical and photographic journey. And it's a variation on some of those themes, featuring some local history, some art history, and of course, photography. The Shaker origins in the United States began outside of Albany, New York, and today, the last remaining members are in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. Interweaving the history of this fascinating Protestant utopian sect with his photography, Chelmsford, Bruce Magnuson will follow their development and influence from the 1700s until today. He will also be highlighting the Shaker villages in Eastern New York, New England, with many still in existence as museums. If anybody has any questions for Mr. Magnuson tonight, please direct them to the chat or the Q&A module, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, or I believe that Bruce had mentioned that he would try to answer them in real time if he can. And so with that, I will turn it over. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks everyone for coming here and spending your Thursday evening with me. And thanks to the Chelmsford Library, and I'll get into it at the end of the presentation as far as sources go, but I can't emphasize enough how much a great resource your local library is. And a lot of the content for this presentation came from that. And I will mention, I actually see somebody in the participant list who I went to high school with. So they're going to keep me honest, I guess, as I talk about my home region. So let's get started. That does not look good. Okay. So this is my certificate trophy, my participation trophy. I took a class up in Enfield, New Hampshire. There's a Shaker village up in Enfield, which is a little few miles south of Hanover, Dartmouth. And they offered a class last winter, and Shakers 101, their education coordinator, Kyle Sandler, put together about a 6-week course on this, and it was actually fairly rigorous. We were reading primary sources. We had to go through quite a lot of reading. There's a lot of resources available. Actually, Hamilton College out in upstate New York is kind of the repository for a lot of the Shaker stuff, and there's an awful lot of Shaker journals. They posted or they printed a, I think it was semi-annual kind of magazine called the Shaker Manifesto. There's a lot of information to Shakers. They went through this, like I said, back in the winter of last year, and it gave me a lot of information, a lot of background that I didn't have in the Shakers. So that influences a lot of the content I will go through. And we'll talk about the agenda. Obviously, one of the Shaker maxims is hands to work and hearts to God. And we'll go through an introduction, take a look at the Shaker origin story, go a bit into their theology, talk about the expansion and contraction of the sect, and then we'll take a quick tour into, at least from here in Chelmsford, two of the closest Shaker villages, Canterbury up in New Hampshire and Harvard out in central Massachusetts. And then we'll talk about the Shaker material culture and modern influences. And then we'll go through a quick tour of other Shaker villages in Eastern New York and New England. So people always ask me, why the Shakers? I was just asked that question this afternoon. And back to the fact that I have somebody from my high school here. This is a map of where I grew up in a town called Guilderland, New York, which is west of Albany, New York. And I went through this at the Hudson River Valley presentation back in June. But this is literally a Google map of the house I grew up in on 24 Friartuck Road. And this is the first Shaker settlement, permanent Shaker settlement in the United States, which is here in what is now Colony, New York. When you do research, it's referred to as Watervliet, we refer to as Niskayuna, which is very, very confusing for an Albany native because those are actual towns that still exist, but they aren't here. But it is in Colony, New York. And actually the North Colony School District is called Shaker. So in high school, when we played teams, one of the teams we played was Shaker. So the Albany Airport was built after World War II, and it actually displaced a lot of the Shaker artifacts here and the buildings. There actually isn't really that much left here. And oddly enough, of all the photographs I have, I actually don't have any photographs of this particular village. And like I said, a lot of it's, one of their main homes was converted into a nursing home, the Ann Lee home. But this is where the original Shaker settlement was, right outside of Albany, New York. And when I was a young lad in high school, I played hockey on Ann Lee Pond, which is a phenomenal place to play outside hockey. And growing up in upstate New York in the 60s and 70s, I never actually skated indoors until I moved here to New England, and then found out what hockey really was. What I was playing was not a very reasonable facsimile, but we did skate on this wonderful pond named Ann Lee Pond and didn't think too much about it. But looking back on it, obviously there's a lot of naming and references to the Shaker sect, and Mother Ann Lee was basically the founder of the Shakers in the United States. She was not the founder of the Shaker sect, but she was the one who took it from England over to the United States. And she actually is buried outside the area here, which I think they may have had to relocate these graves when they built the airport, or they built a baseball stadium here. There's a minor league baseball team, the Albany Colony Yankees, back in the 70s and 80s. I don't think that's a team anymore, but their stadium was built right near where the Shaker stuff is, outside of Albany. So I'll take a quick little video here, which was put together in 2014. There was a exhibition at the New York State Museum in Albany on the Empire State Plaza on their Shakers, and I put together this nice little summary 2.5-minute video, which I think will be a great starting point.
At the dawn of America's Revolution, a small group of devoted believers arrived in New York City, fleeing religious persecution in England. Their leader, Ann Lee, a charismatic and outspoken visionary, challenged them to seek salvation through pacifism, celibacy, confession, and gender equality. Confronted by a culture hostile to these radical convictions, they created their own communities, away from the rest of society and gained thousands of followers. For more than 200 years, they have sought perfection in all they do, from farming to producing goods coveted by the outside world. Their motto, hands to work and hearts to God. The Shakers, America's quiet revolutionaries.
So we will hear that tune, Simple Gifts, many times throughout the presentation. But in the context of the Shakers, like, most things that happen, they didn't happen in a vacuum. So this whole concept of utopia, religious sects searching for, different versions of perfection, there's a lot of that going on. And we'll get into some of the manifestations of that. Obviously, the Second Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, get into that. And so you have within this swath here, which is kind of interesting, it goes really from Eastern New England through upstate New York, down along the Erie and Ontario, and into Ohio. And actually the Shakers extend down into Kentucky. Pleasant Hill actually is one of the more better preserved villages in central Kentucky. And there's a context. You have the Mormons are going there. Joseph Smith begins in Vermont and goes through upstate New York and ends up going out west. And you have the Fourierists, which I believe is based on a person out of France. There's Owenites. A lot of different sects are going on. The Shakers were probably, they're the earliest. They start in America in 1774. A lot of these ones come later in the early 1800s. So there's no doubt that the Shakers are the seminal utopian sect, but there's other ones that are going on, and you see this area is fairly consistent with a lot of these different things spread out through basically the upper Ohio Valley. And the topic of utopia is fairly interesting, actually very interesting. It was coined by Sir Thomas More, famous for the play and the movie A Man for All Seasons, and he published a novel Utopia in 1516. And it's kind of a play on words. It's kind of a mixture of the Greek otopos, which means no place, and then the Greek utopos, which means good place. So it kind of really works out perfectly. It's the perfect place, but it actually is no place. And one of the great quotes from the book is, "Nobody owns anything, but everyone is rich. For what greater wealth can there be than cheerfulness, peace of mind, and freedom from anxiety?" So that concept obviously is very attractive. And within the Boston area, you have various manifestations of this. And you have Fruitlands, which we'll get to in a little more detail quickly here, which is out in Harvard, Massachusetts, which was an attempt at a utopian sect by the Transcendentalists. You have Brook Farm, which is in West Roxbury, another attempt by it, and actually gets kind of satirized in a book, Blithewald Romance, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who actually participated in Brook Farm and supposedly wanted to be a Shaker at one point. And then in Harvard, Mass, you have the Shaker Village. And that manifests itself today in this museum, Fruitlands, which is in Harvard, Mass, and it's off of Route 2, Prospect Hill Road, a very beautiful site. And you look down a hill over here, and you can see Monadnock over in this area. And you have basically a representation of a lot of these things going on. You have the founder of it is a woman named Clara Endicott Sears, who was born in 1863 and dies in 1960, so she lives almost to 100. And she's the one who's kind of a preservationist. She's from a wealthy Boston family, and she actually does some pretty decent research. I was asking Kyle about, how within the Shaker research community is her stuff viewed, and Gleanings from a Shaker Journalist is published in 1917, one of the earlier kind of conglomerations of Shaker study. And she said she's pretty well regarded. She wasn't great about footnoting things, I guess, but once again, it's kind of within the time. But also the reason Fruitlands is there is this transcendentalists are there, most notably Bronson Alcott. And they start a farm there in the 1840s, I believe, and they're going to live this kind of, very perfect thing. But it's kind of interesting when you see the transcendentalists and some of the tension that goes on. And Ralph Waldo Emerson had a famous quote, said, "They look well in July. We will see them in December. And that proves very prophetic. They don't last very long. They had this kind of really pie in the sky. They're kind of the quintessential examples of people who just are not very practical, have a lot of great ideas. They have this kind of view of perfection, but they aren't really good about executing it. And they don't use beasts of burden. They don't use manure. They start the village in June, so they haven't planted. So basically the whole thing falls apart. And the guy, I think Charles Lane and Bronson Alcott were the two behind it, and the whole thing kind of ends after less than a year. But on this museum, you have that farm still there, and then you have also the Shakers. And I'll show you photographs. They move a Shaker building from Harvard to Fruitlands. There's also exhibits on Native Americans, and there's exhibits on the Hudson River School. So if you've seen some of my presentations, this is kind of the perfect place for me, since it kind of taps into a lot of things I'm interested in. And it is a beautiful place on top of that to photograph. So like I said, it's on Prospect Hill Road is the road you drive in to go to it, and then you're on top of a hill, and you look over the valley into the distance into northern Massachusetts, and I think that is Monadnock there, or Wachusett, I forget which. I think it might be Wachusett, that may be Monadnock, into southern New Hampshire. And so this is a Shaker. This was, I think, the oldest Shaker building in the Harvard Shaker community, and it's moved here to Fruitlands. And this is the farm in Fruitlands, and down here at the bottom of the hill. And this is where Bronson Alcott et al. Had their kind of disastrous 8 or 9 months. And, there's a lot of different things going on at Fruitlands. And one of the ones here, this is a sculpture of a Native American, which I became kind of enamored with as a great photographic subject. And then relatively recently, I was kind of like, this doesn't seem quite right. And, you got this kind of headdress going on here, which is not representative, certainly, of New England Native Americans. And sure enough, I've been going to Fruitlands for years. I didn't notice till just this spring, there's actually a little plaque in front of this sculpture saying, basically, they're trying to work with the Nipmuc tribe to kind of come up with something. But this was, I think, in the early 1900s, 1920s. It was a sculpture that has been on the site that long, but it's got a lot of problems. It's kind of the idealized, Western version of Native Americans a la 1920, which doesn't really hold up too well today, but for the time being is still there. So the early Shakers, Shakers start themselves in Manchester, England. Got the Industrial Revolution is just beginning, literally just beginning, and it's called the Wardley Society. It's a husband and wife start this society. That's kind of an offshoot of the Quakers. And, they had this very, very physical worship, and they get the name of Shaking Quakers, which kind of evolves into Shakers. Their official name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Coming. And they are millennialists, which means basically there's a couple different versions of millennialists, and I'm not a theologian, but they believe that Jesus came, oddly enough, in 1747, and the spirit of Jesus has come in, and then there's going to be a millennium, then there's going to be the last judgment, and then there's going to be eternity. Other ones believe the millennium just kind of begins, and then you will have Jesus' return and the last judgment at the same time, but they're what are called premillennialists when you talk about millennialism. And as I mentioned, Mother Ann Lee is really the charismatic leader, and she pretty much joins them. She's got a very, very difficult situation. She's illiterate. She loses all 4 of her children in infancy. Her husband is an alcoholic blacksmith, I believe. She becomes a Shaker. And she starts having visions, and we'll see this, hence the title of my talk here, Visions of the Shakers. But she has visions, and one of the visions is that she should bring this sect to America. So she takes basically 9 people with her to America in 1774. And as the video said, she shows up, excuse me, on the shores of New York City in 1774, and they're a pacifist sect. As you're familiar with the Quakers, they're pacifists, and certainly the Shakers keep that going as they're a break off from the Quakers. Of course, what's happening in 1774? Well, that's the eve of the American Revolution. So a bunch of pacifists showing up on the shores of New York in 1774 doesn't thrill the locals. And so they basically have a very, very difficult time of it going up the Hudson River Valley. They end up, she actually ends up kind of the headquarters for her. They never have a permanent settlement while she is ahead, because she dies in 1884, and the first villages don't come until 1784 and don't come until 1787. But she is up there in Harvard. There's actually a building. Most of the Harvard buildings that are Shaker are privately owned. There's a square, it's called the Square House, and that was basically kind of her main area of operating for it. And they end up getting persecuted quite a bit. And she ends up, some of the stories say that she ends up she dies young, and one of the reasons is she's dragged down the stairs at one point and fractures her skull, and they believe that shortened her life quite a bit. And one of her great quotes is, and she's got some good ones, is, "We should do everything as if we had 1,000 years to live and as if we were going to die tomorrow." So speaking of Mother Ann, I wanted to bring in Brother Arnold, and he is one of the last surviving Shakers up in Sabbath Day Lake, and he's definitely the most prominent, and he's pretty good about social media, or at least videos and stuff. So if you go to the Shaker website up in Sabbath Day Lake, he posts a video, I think almost every day, at least every week. And in this one here, he talks about her birthday. She was born on February 29th. So they celebrate her birthday on March 1st on years that aren't a leap year. And he reads some of the primary sources on Mother Ann. So I think we'll take a listen for a minute or two of what he has to say about Mother Ann.
Peace, everyone. We recently celebrated our ever-blessed Mother's birthday on March 1st. As most of you know, she was actually born on February 29th. And so we can only actually celebrate the real day once every 4 years. Some people say, why don't you do it on the 28th? Because it's always 28 days, that's why. The 29th obviously becomes the 1st, and that's why we celebrate on March 1st. I would like to share with you some readings from the testimonies. Mother Ann Lee was a woman of strong constitution, rather exceeding the ordinary size of women, rather thick, but very straight and well-proportioned in form, of light complexion, of blue eyes, her hair of a light chestnut brown. In appearance, she was very majestic, and her countenance was such as inspired confidence and respect, and by many of the world who saw her without prejudice, she was called beautiful. To her faithful children, spoken of spiritually, she appeared to possess a degree of dignified beauty and heavenly love transcending that of mortals. She possessed remarkable powers and faculties of mind, which were greatly enlarged and strengthened by the gift of God. At times, when under the power and operation of the Holy Ghost, her countenance shone with the glory of God, and her form and actions were divinely beautiful and very angelic. Her power and influence at such times were great, beyond description, and no one was able to gainsay or resist the power by which she spoke. Though Mother's words were generally few, they were always adapted to the occasion, and it did not appear that she ever spoke in vain. Her whole soul was always engaged in the work of God, and the Spirit of God seemed to breathe in her all words and actions. So great and godlike was the power of her spirit that with a few words, and often with a single word, or touch of the hand, she would instantly raise individuals and sometimes a whole assembly, such a measure of the power of conviction and repentance that in a few minutes the floor has been wet with tears.
So what we have is a charismatic leader. So obviously, these testimonies, the primary sources at the time that Mother Ann Lee was around really speak to this. And I know when, in the years I've been kind of following the Shakers, but, going to the Shaker villages and kind of becoming interested in their story, one of the things that seemed to be pretty not straightforward, but pretty clear was the Shakers considered her the female embodiment of God and kind of on par with Jesus. And so the thing about the Shakers is a lot of stuff isn't written down. It evolves over time. There's different people who write different things. There isn't a solid, theology that is, unchallenged. So I talked to Kyle about this, and he said, in general, that's not what the real core Shaker belief was. She was imbued with the Holy Spirit. There is a dual Godhead, they believe. They believe there's a male and female Godhead, which once again, he says, actually kind of appears in early Christianity in like the 400s or 500s AD. So, she is the leader. She's very charismatic, but we'll see as time goes on, kind of the interpretation of her changes. And, like when they become a very different sect, when they start having, basically permanent settlements. And that's something that you're not seeing within her leadership. they come into the, the video mentioned, you're coming into this world for religious persecution. You're coming into the land of the Puritans. It's still 150 years after the Puritans, so a lot of the Puritan stuff is kind of going away after the First Great Awakening, which is around the 1740s or 1750s. But you have this concept of predestination, which basically means kind of it's written stone, as you're born, even before you're born, whether you're going to be saved or not. And you have these, very draconian lifestyle that you see in Puritan New England, and particularly here in Massachusetts Bay. And there's a lot of precedent for Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, and Mary Duffy is a Quaker and actually gets hanged, and there's a statue of her in front of the Massachusetts State House if you ever get a chance to see that. So you have that kind of coming into the context, and the Shakers coming to this in 1774. And their major tenets are the 3 C's, which is confession, communal, and celibacy. And so confession means it's actually you confess to God, but it's witnessed by an elder in the Shaker community. There is communal living and there is celibacy. And it wasn't until recently that a term really helped kind of really illustrate this for me. Is basically the Shakers are a Protestant monastery. And when you put it in that context, it actually makes a lot more sense. And people first thing people talk about the Shakers is the celibacy, and it's like, well, that's why they didn't they didn't expand, and there's only a couple of them left now. And of course the real answer is a lot more complicated than that, and we'll come back to Brother Arnold a little bit later and he'll talk some about that. But when you put it in the context of certainly in Catholicism and monasteries, and of course even in Buddhism you have monks, and that's what the Shakers are. And they're really, separate from the world. They do have to have the interactions with the world. You got these economic things going on they have to deal with. And they have a few Shakers who go out and sell their goods and stuff like that. But basically, the Shaker communities are separate from, they do call it the world, which is the outside. As I mentioned before, they are pacifists. And over time, these millennial laws come up, which are written and govern Shaker behavior. And we'll get to some of the more specifics of what that entails. But with regard to communal living, once again, the source of this does go back to the Bible. And you can go to Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45, where they say all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. So once again, this is the 1800s. They are not Marxists, because Marxist is born in 1808 or 1818 or something. But one of the more fascinating things about the Shakers is a lot of the contemporary people who have opinions about them. And so within their time, they were known. You have here, the famous quote from Marx, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And you have Marx's co-author of the Communist Manifesto, just Frederick Engels. And he talks about, in 1844, the first people to set up a society on the basis of communion of goods in America, indeed in the whole world, were the so-called Shakers. So, does that mean that all communistic information, whatever, traces back to the Shakers? No, but it's really interesting that, one of the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto is making this comment, at the time in 1844, that the Shakers are kind of the first manifestation of this. And one of the things that the Shakers do is there's a signing of the covenant. And the signing of the covenant is basically means, you're kind of going all in. You give over all of your possessions, land, everything to the Shakers to be used for the communal good. And so the Shakers kind of had this hierarchy. And when you look back, when I showed you the map of the first Shaker settlement, or one of the first Shaker settlements there by the Albany airport, you have a North family, you have a South family, you have a Church family. The Church family is kind of the most serious Shakers. And then one of the other families will be what's called a gathering order. And basically those are the kind of try before you buy for both the Shakers and the potential converts. So they enter a gathering order for a year or so to make sure that everybody's, kind of copacetic with what's going on. And if they decide that they're going to join, then they sign the covenant. And that means they become a full-fledged Shaker, and they give up all their possessions to the communal society with the Shakers. And this becomes kind of an issue at the end of the Shakers, where you have Canterbury and Sabbath-day Lake are really the last two, and Canterbury stops the covenant, and Sabbath-day Lake keeps it going. And that creates a real rift, because once you stop the covenant, that means you're not accepting any new members. And obviously that does not mean for a long life for the sect. So, and the leaders are, as the video talked about, it is gender equality, which is true, although we'll get into a little bit of the nuances of that. And from a leadership perspective, this is really kind of radical for, late 1700s, early to mid 1800s. You have a male and female at the head. You have an elder and an eldress basically leading every Shaker village, which is pretty radical. And these are the communities. So the first one is New Lebanon, or known as Mount Lebanon, which is about 20 miles outside of Albany. You have Watervliet, which is the colony one, and then you go into Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and then Maine. And it's kind of ironic that the last one that was actually established as far as the original ones is the last one that's still standing, and actually one of the poorest at the time. Sabbath Lake, throughout most of its history, is one of the poor Shaker villages. So Shaker, the work is a big component of Shaker, hands to work, hearts to God. And they're trying to create heaven on earth. And work is a kind of prayer. So they have these Shaker millennial laws, and they're very, very rigid. And he gets into that a little bit later on. But in the summer, they awake at 4 to 4:30 in the morning, and in the winter, 5 to 5:30. And they go to bed at 8 p.m. in the summer and 9 p.m. in the winter. So once again, it's a very agrarian farm community. So you're dealing the whole thing with the sunrise and all that, and you have to deal with the animals and the crops. And one of the great Shaker research people was Edward Deming Andrews, and one of his quotes was, "A Shaker idea was that in consecration, not compulsion, lay the secret to a successful economy." So this kind of, plays more into the very much into the communistic side, where, it is a communal community, and you're doing things for the common good. And these are small communities, couple hundred usually. I think maybe one of the bigger ones was 600. The sect kind of tops out at around 6,000. So you can have, these kind of things that happen in a smaller group than you have in a larger group. But from their motivation perspective, you have a lot of very motivated workers, which leads to a lot of great productivity. And as we'll see right below here, that they have a lot of things that manifest themselves from that. And they do, this whole thing about the gender equal. They were equal, but the kind of roles they played were the gender typical roles that you see. So the farming, the manual labor were done by the males, the cleaning, the cooking, kitchen work, that was done by the females. So even though they were equal, they did have this kind of, dividing line within the typical gender roles as far as what people did for work. But there wasn't any kind of hierarchy there. They were considered equal. And in the course of what they're doing for 100 years in the 1800s, they invent all these amazing things, from the circular saw to the industrial washing machine, even the dump truck, flat broom. And a lot of people sometimes conflate the Shakers with the Amish, and of course they're very, very different. And the Shakers were not against modernity. They were really pro being more efficient, because, as I said, work was a kind of prayer. And the more you could do, the better you could do. If you could do industrial washing machines, you could do the laundry a lot quicker, so you could do something else, and you wouldn't have to spend all the time down by the creek with the washboard and all that stuff. And you could do these. If you ever particularly go to Hancock, they have a very, very well preserved washing machine there, and it's something out of the people who clean the industrial linens and things like that. It is quite an operation, and they really did a lot of amazing stuff within the industrialization. And they didn't patent very many of them. They just were, anybody who wanted to use them could use them. So I mentioned before, the Second Great Awakening is this religious revival that happens in the 1800s. And it has a lot to do with the map I showed at the beginning, with these kind of swath of utopian and religious fervor that's going through the United States. And it's a pretty core thing as to what happens as the Shakers begin to expand westward. So we'll take a quick look at a couple of minute video here.
A wave of religious revival is known as the Second Great Awakening. It was the largest outpouring of religious sentiment since the American Revolution.
Just after the Revolution, the percentage of church membership in America was not that great, but it increased over fivefold in the course of the 19th century. What happened is that Protestantism, which is based on individual interpretation of the Bible, when it was mingled with the idea of religious toleration and separation of church and state, suddenly it was liberated completely.
The Second Great Awakening replaced the old Puritan religion of New England and its emphasis on original sin. Instead, the new religion stressed that by taking personal responsibility and doing hard work, anyone could achieve salvation. With this optimistic message, the Methodist and Baptist churches went through explosive growth periods. Thousands of people turned up for emotional revival meetings where entire communities would join together to repent their sins.
These preachers would get up and give hellfire sermons and also hopeful sermons as well, but very, very passionate, emotional, full of anecdotes, even humor, colloquial expression, and they would reduce a lot of their audiences to not only tears but also to dancing, and a lot of people had what they call the jerks, where they would jerk just uncontrollably. They would speak in tongues. It was an extraordinarily emotional kind of heartfelt religion.
In towns along the newly built Erie Canal in upstate New York, a Presbyterian evangelist named Charles G. Finney held so many fiery revival meetings that the area became known as the Burned Over District. Finney and other preachers encouraged Christians to work to achieve perfection here on earth, and their message inspired a new reform movement that swept across America.
So I do want to, just a couple of questions popped in, I noticed in the Q&A. One is, after Ann Lee left England, did the Shakers persist in England? To my knowledge, no. They were being persecuted. The ward leads kind of ceded the Shaker religion to Ann Lee, and she basically took, there were 9 or so folks, and that was where Shaker went forward, and it did not continue in England. And the question came, are there any Shaker buildings left in Turingham, Mass? It's a good question. There may be a couple of private buildings. A lot of the Shaker buildings, oddly enough, end up on prisons. I know Enfield, Connecticut is on a prison, I believe, and definitely Shirley, Massachusetts is on a prison. Tyringham, there isn't much there. I did some quick research to see if it was worth it to go out there and photograph anything, and I don't remember the specifics. I was tell you I didn't go out there and photograph. So as of 3 months ago, I thought there wasn't much out there. So as we said, we see here that the location of the Shaker settlements, you have this up here in Sabbath Lake, which is the furthest north, and then you go down here in Kentucky and Indiana. Now, some of these don't last very long, particularly some of the ones in upstate New York. They really don't last very long at all. The ones in Western New York, there's one in Groveland or something, and there are actually a couple of down in Georgia and Florida that don't last very long at all. But here in Eastern New York is where Waterville and Mount Lebanon are. And like I said, the best preserved one is Pleasant Hill here, just about an hour or two south of Kentucky, Lexington, I think. Lexington or Louisville, I forget which. So there we go, get back here. So the Second Great Awakening, what the Shakers do is they kind of piggyback off that. So there's a great diary that was written by Issachar Bates, who was a Shaker convert in the late 1700s, and he gets tapped to go west, which in those days means Northwest Territories, which is basically Ohio, and go out there and try and find some converts. And so they're kind of piggybacking off that Western expansion and what's going on in these revivalist things at the Second Great Awakening. And so the Shakers are not big on sermons except when they are trying to convert people. So they piggyback along this out to the west, and they get more converts, and they actually are able to get villages, and it leads to a fairly significant expansion of the sect. And then on top of that, and Brother Arnold will get into this, but one of the big bumps in population for the Shakers were orphans. So once again, in the 1800s, orphans are very prevalent. Certainly childhood death is very prevalent. There was a book that was written by the former president of Harvard, Drew Faust, that talks about death in the 1800s. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, I think most people know that people had a lot of children, and certainly most of the children do not live until adulthood. So the presence of death is very, very real in everybody's life, more so certainly than we have today, fortunately. But there's a cholera plague in 1833, and that really creates an awful lot of orphans, and a lot of those get absorbed into Shaker communities. And so that does bump up the population, and Brother Arnold will argue that that's kind of a false bumping up of the population, because a lot of those orphans do not end up staying as Shakers. But as I mentioned before, the population tops out at around 6,000 in the 1850s before the Civil War. And that really is the heyday, the height of the Shaker population is right before the Civil War, and then all these changes come after the Civil War on a whole mess of levels, and you see the Shakers to start to kind of on a downward trend. You get into, you know, basically the industrialization of the United States, more expansion west, but basically the Shakers kind of reach their peak, at least population-wise, in the 1850s. And then in the 1830s to the 1850s, you have this era of manifestations, which is, these are called gift drawings that these are like quilts that are just amazing, amazingly intricate and beautiful pieces of work. What you have are these visions that kind of come into the Shaker community, and they start driving a lot of behavior. And quite frankly, the elders are pretty concerned about it. So they tend to try and tamp this down, but it creates kind of a fervor in the Shaker communities. And there was a novel written 8 years ago called The Visionist by Rachel Urquhart. And it's really interesting in the fact that it portrays the main character is this girl who has a vision. She's at a Shaker village, gets into the Shaker village, her family gets split apart. It's really ties into a lot of the concepts of, you know, how people ended up as Shakers in the mid 1800s. But she's this visionist, and so she gets special treatment. And then she starts thinking, like, you know, if I don't have visions, I'm going to lose this special treatment. Are these visions real? Am I just, you know, conjuring them myself? And it really kind of gets into some of the interesting things when you don't really think necessarily a lot when you hear the term visionist, and like, what would that mean? What are the ramifications of that? And certainly in the time frame with the 1800s, you have all kinds of stuff going on with, you know, seances and spiritualism, and all these things are really, really rife through the American culture all the way through the 1800s. Fascinating novel. And they start tightening the millennial laws. Like I said, the elders aren't terribly excited about this. And they also close the Shaker worship to the public in the 1840s, because once again, they feel like they're becoming a spectacle. And people are coming to see these people who have these visions and start doing crazy things. And, you know, it's a sideshow on a Sunday morning. And that's not what the elders want the Shakers to be perceived as. And one of the intellectual stalwarts of really Shakerism, certainly in the mid to late 1800s, is this guy named Frederick Evans. He is in Mount Lebanon, which really was the center of the Shaker. That was the headquarters per se. Like, everybody kind of reported into Mount Lebanon. These, you know, villages were autonomous to a certain degree, and you do see a lot of variation. We'll even get into that, into their burial practices, but they tried to have some sort of sense of cohesion. So Frederick Evans is out in Mount Lebanon, and he's one of these fascinating figures in American history. And he lives for about, you know, 80 something years. And once again, he's having contact with President Lincoln. He's having contact with Leo Tolstoy. I mean, once again, going to the point that the Shakers were known in their time by their contemporaries. And he has some great quotes. This is kind of maybe one of the ultimate quotes from a communistic society is, "The divine man has no right to waste money upon what you will call beauty in his house or his daily life, while there are people living in misery." He publishes a pamphlet called 12 Reasons Why No Rational Being Should Use Tobacco. This is, you know, mid 1800s, certainly a man before his time. But as I mentioned with Lincoln, the Shakers are pacifists. So once again, they kind of find themselves in the middle of the Civil War, not here in New England, obviously, or even upstate New York, but out in the western part, particularly in Kentucky. So Kentucky is a slave state, but is not part of the Confederacy. And so you have both armies kind of going through Kentucky, and they're ravaging the villages for food, and he doesn't want them to ravage them for soldiers. So he goes and petitions Lincoln to grant an exemption for the Shakers from military service. And it's pretty interesting because Lincoln, being president in the 1860s, one of the things you spend a lot of your day doing is people will like line up and talk to the president. And I guess he wrote in some of his letters like how annoying it was to have this line of citizens out his door, and he had to basically, you know, hear their grievances. And so Frederick Evans, I think another couple of Shakers, were able to get Lincoln's ear, and they actually made him a chair that they ended up giving to him. And he does begrudgingly exempt them from military service. And as I mentioned before, he had a multi-year correspondence with Leo Tolstoy in Russia. So pretty fascinating guy that, you know, once again, this is, you know, contemporaries are certainly aware of the Shakers and what's going on with them. So back to Brother Arnold, this is a pretty good capsule of the Shaker history as it kind of evolves. And Brother Arnold's been a Shaker he's in his early to mid 60s now, and I think he's been a shaker for about 40 years. And then talking to Kyle up in Enfield, he says he's just an amazing resource, and he's actually pretty objective about the shakers, realizing they had their faults, there are a lot of challenges, but he's an amazing repository for shaker history. And so he gives a pretty good overview of kind of how the sect transitions.
I think if there's a general feeling about it, it was that you lived your religion. It wasn't something, you didn't go to this building one day a week and spend an hour. It was requiring of you to give your all to God and to strive to work out your salvation each and every day. Learn from the mistakes of yesterday.
All right.
Pick it up, move on. And I saw a group of people who were very human, but still striving, still struggling, and in many ways achieving the goals that they had set for themselves. They were very Pentecostal. They went right back to the church. So they spoke in tongues, they whirled, they twirled. They did all of those gifts of the Spirit. And that was apparent when the first Shakers came to America in 1774. But it didn't last very long. The man who would eventually come to head the church in America, Joseph Meacham, was a Baptist. And Father Joseph saw law and order a lot more than he ever saw spiritual gifts. Everything in our lives got laid out for a square gospel. It was very, very earthbound in that sense. And one of his dictums was, order is heaven's first law. Well, you can imagine that that worship was not orderly at all. And so he starts to quickly get away from that. And he's the one who introduces the dance steps, in which he had a revelation, and he saw that the angels of God were above our heads, and that they were doing the same marches and the same gifts that we had, but they were doing them more perfectly. So he introduced something called the square order shuffle, and then that develops into a lot of other things like the ring dances and all that. It allowed for a corporate worship, everybody doing the same thing at the same time. Now within that, though, sometimes gifts still came out, and people would whirl occasionally still. We don't see gifts of the Spirit in those outward forms the way they did in the old days. It's not that we're not open to them, and if they happen, they happen. But I don't think that we look for or anticipate their arrival in our midst. By the 1880s, they start to write little things about the outward signs of faith, and that when there's a deeper work that's taking place in the heart, they no longer become necessary. For believers, all things are gifts. They come from God. And every single thing that motivates us is a gift. So that gift, died out. The gift of marching and dancing, that also had its season, and it stopped here around 1900. So what we have now is a much quieter meeting. But I think that it's a deeper meaning because the people are required to think more, to react more, and to really speak from their heart on some subject. In my opinion, a fatal mistake. And that was that in the 1830s, they decided to basically abandon trying to convert adults anymore and start raising large numbers of children, in the hope that if they raised them from youth, that they would see the purity of the gospel, that they would want to stay and make Shakers.
Orphans and...
Right, basically orphans. Or and the Civil War really, really expedited that, because there were so many children that were left bereft of parents, and fathers in particular. And in those days, single mothers could not make it. So they'd had to find places to have their children be raised, and the Shakers were often that destination. And then with the rise of all of those orphanages, Shaker communities plugged into them, and they started having kids come up in great numbers. Well, it swells the ranks, but really you have to start looking through it, and you start seeing there's really very few adults in any community, and it's mostly children, and most of those children don't stay. So every 5 years there's this big turnover of personnel, and it looks like, oh yeah, there are 50 members. Well, that's not really. But so when they started to do that and just rely on children to fill up the ranks, they lost a lot of what it was, the zeal, a lot of compromising going on to be able to keep these kids and to turn them into Shakers so that their communities could be perpetuated. We pray very earnestly, all three of us pray quite earnestly every single day for competent vocations to be brought to this way of life. so that Shakerism will endure in this place we so lovingly call chosen land.
Very articulate and very interesting guy. So I see there was a comment about Free Will Baptists, and he mentions there that Joseph Meacham is a Baptist, and so there's no doubt. I'm not sure of the delineation between Free Will Baptists and quote unquote regular Baptists, but there's no doubt that the Shakers are poaching people, and certainly from a evangelical perspective, Issachar Bates, the one I mentioned before, goes out to Ohio to recruit in the context of the Second Great Awakening. He's a Baptist. So the Shakers were the earliest, but there's other ones, and certainly there's competition. There's no doubt that there's everybody's competing for souls, and as Brother Ronald mentions, they're certainly competing for members, and that's definitely a challenge going along. And this is where the early communities are before mentioned, going from Niskayuna down to Sabbath-day Lake. So all here within New England and Eastern New York. And the museums you have up here, Sabbath-day Lake, you have Enfield, you have Canterbury, you have Hancock, you have Mount Lebanon, you have Water Valete. Not sure, there's kind of sort of one in Chatham. It's a museum, but it's actually not specifically on a site. It's kind of related to Mount Lebanon. And then out here in Kentucky, you have two, and you have Pleasant Hill, which is here. So we'll take a quick spin through the ones that are closest to here at Chelmsford. We have Canterbury Village, which is right up 93, a little bit outside of Concord, New Hampshire. This is a map of the original village here at the main drag going through here. And this is the meeting house here up on a hill. And it is up on a hill. They have a printing shop. Another quote from Ann Lee: "Clean your rooms well, for good spirits will not live where there is dirt. There is no dirt in heaven." My mother would definitely buy that. So it's on a hill. Great place for sledding. Very long entrance up here. And this is one of the more remote ones. And it was funny because Kyle was saying that most of the Shaker, because they did a lot of trade, they were really on major trade routes. And you see like Hancock's right off of Route 20 out in around Pittsfield. But here I had driven out the day before to take photographs, and I was kind of kidding Kyle. I said, there's no way you can argue that Canterbury is, on a major road. You have to kind of snake your way off of various roads around Concord to get there. Every time I go there, I'm like, well, how did it end up here? But I guess he said it was actually one of the Shakers was related to one of the farms, I think, and they were able to get some of the land. So that's how they ended up in Canterbury, New Hampshire. And if you see my presentations, there will be infrared. So this is an infrared photo of the village looking back from the fields. This is a winter version of it, kind of my homage to Andrew Wyeth, kind of more of what's not there as opposed to what is there. But you see the fallow beds here and going down to some of the Shaker barns and the doorway in the snow. And a lot of the Shaker villages will have the remains of barns. They were stone structures for the most part. So you'll see, obviously, the round barn out in Hancock is one of the iconic Shaker buildings, but this is a remnant of the barn here at Canterbury. And these were large, large structures. And once again, the winter, very peaceful place. And symmetry is certainly a hallmark of Shaker architecture. So, as a photographer, that kind of appeals to me. And this is kind of going at it a little bit extreme, but, the Shakers are very, very symmetrical. And they also have foliage. So there's actually a pond behind. They actually have cattle up at this Shaker in Canterbury, but there's hopefully in the next couple of weeks, you'll be seeing some of this, but there was a swan who decided to grace his presence when I was taking photographs here a few years back. And as I mentioned, the cemetery. So this cemetery in Canterbury, it is one headstone for all the Shakers. So it's a communal cemetery, not individual headstones for the individual brothers and sisters, as we saw out in Water Valete with Ann Lee. That's not the case there. And we'll see that in Harvard, but in other Shaker communities, they do this way. So there is variation. I said they're semi-autonomous villages, I think is probably the best way to describe it. Oop. So as I mentioned, Harvard is here off of Route 2. And basically you get off of Route 2, you go left, you go toward Fruitland, you go right, you go toward Harvard, the Harvard Shaker Village, South Shaker Road here. So once again, you see the church family Shakers, you have the north and the south. This is actually contemporary maps. So you can see here is obviously a housing development. So these are all gone. There still are some buildings here, and there's some buildings here, and there's a Shaker cemetery that we'll get to. These are all privately owned. There are no public buildings. And like I said, the square house, which is kind of Ann Lee's headquarters here when she was alive was right down in here. They did have a tour back in 2010 where they allowed you to get into the houses, and it was great, and it was very welcoming those people to do it. Unfortunately, it was like the worst day for photography. So overcast, blah day, but it was really interesting to get into some of these buildings, and they're beautiful. What's not so beautiful is this is the Whipping Stone. And so this is something I just became aware of this year, but this is out off the South Shaker Road. And like I said, the Shakers were persecuted. And so one of the lieutenants for Mother Ann Lee was a guy named James Whitaker. And he becomes the second leader when Ann Lee passes away in 1884. He actually doesn't live very long. And one of the reasons they believe is they were persecuted, and a couple of Shakers were brought out and whipped at this location off of the South Shaker Road in Harvard. And they've erected a stone in memory of this. And he was one of the ones who was whipped. So they were really subjected to some pretty serious persecution. And this is basically almost in somebody's front yard. So I took this, the late snowfall, I think like in March of this year, and it's kind of interesting. You just kind of wander along, and it was pretty easy to find with, no foliage and everything, but literally there's a driveway like right over here. And this is a Shaker barn, which is privately owned, right off the South Shaker Road. And once again, it wouldn't be a Shaker settlement without a ruins of a barn. So you have the stone barn here, and it overlooks this magnificent Shaker edifice here in Harvard. So the Harvard Cemetery is one of the more unique Shaker things you'll see. It's called a lollipop cemetery for obvious reasons. The headstones kind of look like lollipops. And it was refurbished, I don't know, within the last 10 years or so. It's right off of South Shaker Road. It is open to the public, I think. I've never had any problem going there, but it's one of my go-to places. Just kind of a fascinating, contemplative place to go to. And certainly in the winter, it's good for snow photography. And it kind of is right there within the woods, and so you get this kind of nice, foggy late winter day where the kind of the headstones, lollipops, kind of go into the woods behind it. And it's a great place for photography and to kind of think a little bit about the folks who were there 200 years ago. So we'll switch into material culture and modern influences. And this is pretty much how we know the Shakers. And so a lot of this section is based on a book that was written 2 years ago by a Boston University professor named William D. Moore. It's called Shaker Fever, America's 20th Century Fascination with a Communitarian Sect. And it's really interesting. And so I said, most of us, I came to Shakers. Obviously, I grew up near the Shakers, but truth be told, most of what I knew from the Shakers came from Shaker furniture. And just to get ourselves straight, material culture is the physical objects or quote unquote things that belong to, represent, or were created by a group of people within a particular culture. And this is actually from the Currier Museum up in Manchester, New Hampshire, and they have some Shaker stuff on display. And actually, that author spoke right before the pandemic in January of 2020. I dragged my long-suffering wife to that. And there was a symposium on Shakers, and he spoke there. And I will say his book is much better than his lecture. But this is one of the pieces they have up there. And it's a little bit, later Shaker. You have a mirror built in here in the back of a chair, which reflects more Shaker furniture in the museum exhibit. So, like I mentioned before, Shakers were, known by pretty well-known people within their time. And this is a quote that we walked into a grim room where several grim hats were hanging on grim pegs, and the time was grimly told by a grim clock. So that was actually Charles Dickens. So Dickens goes on his famous speaking tours in the 1840s and has a lot of comments on the United States. He writes a book too. I forget the name of the book. Escapes me now. He does write a book on it. And a lot of his comments are not so complimentary to America in general, and certainly not to the Shakers. And kind of ironic here, 170 years later, we kind of deify the whole Shaker aesthetic, where his view at the time was, this is pretty grim stuff. But I guess I would argue 1840s in most places in Western Europe and America were pretty grim stuff. So what happens is, like a lot of things you see with the Depression and the New Deal, a lot of these agencies, most notably the WPA and the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, a lot of seminal artistic things come out of this. And one of this is there was this creation of an index of American design. So they want to kind of create a national spirit. So they come up with this idea of let's like index inventory stuff that's American. And so you have these two collectors, Edward Deming Andrews and Faith Young Andrews. They're scholars and collectors. They're very controversial because they were selling Shaker stuff. They were buying and selling. So they were into it from a commercial perspective. He was also into it from an intellectual perspective. He tried to get into Yale and was given a lecturer position at Yale and then had a falling out. But a lot of his stuff does become kind of what we know as a Shaker aesthetic. And he partners with this photographer, William F. Winter Jr., and this is one of his photos on the right, to document Shakers. And these are staged. I mean, these are not Shaker buildings. And so they kind of put this stuff together to make it look aesthetically pleasing. And you have these nice little area rugs, and you have all this stuff nice and neat and everything else. And this becomes kind of the motif that we see the Shakers through. And this becomes 3 exhibitions in the 1930s at pretty esteemed museums, one being the New York State Museum in Albany. They have a show in 1930 called The Community Industries of the Shakers. And the Berkshire Museum out in Pittsfield has one Shaker exhibition in 1932. And then the Whitney down in New York City has a show in 1935 called Shaker Handicrafts. And that's basically the lens we see the Shakers through. And it was interesting. I was in this class up in Enfield, and one of the members was a board member of the Enfield Shaker Museum. And we were, 3 or 4 classes into it. And she made the comment, she's like, I had no idea about any of this stuff with this, celibacy and this communal, all this stuff. She's like, why aren't we promoting that more? And of course, I made kind of the snide comment. I said, well, you probably get more people coming up looking at Shaker, furniture than you will somebody like, hey, let's go come see the celibate sect that was, a precursor of communism. But that's what most people really know about the Shakers. And it was just kind of interesting, somebody who got to the board of that still really wasn't really aware of that. And this picks up speed in the 1950s when you had the Cold War. Once again, you have more focus on Americana and nationalism. And so I do see a question about when they first start making and selling Shaker boxes. I don't know the year of those. I have a picture I'll show you in 1910 where they were literally making them by the boatload. And this is what you have is the evolution of the Shakers. They started having fewer members, but they need to bring in revenue. And so they become a lot more focused on producing goods that are revenue producing. So you see the seeds come into play, and you see brooms, and you see Shaker boxes, which I forget who came up with the oval construction, but it's one of these kind of very, very simple but extremely unique. I had a video on it. I didn't have time to add to this presentation, but as far as creating a Shaker box, and I'll get into a little bit later. There was actually somebody doing it up at the Big E yesterday. Oh, here's right here. So this is a brother doing Shaker boxes in the 1900s. And so you see he's doing these in a relatively mass-produced way. And literally yesterday, I was at the Big E exhibition out in West Springfield in the New Hampshire Pavilion, and lo and behold, the artist or craftsperson on display was Barbara Beeler, who's making Shaker boxes. And you have these oval Shaker boxes here with some more enhancements, which I doubt you would see from the Shakers, and some inlay, but still, obviously based off the oval box motif from the Shakers. And this is still going strong in 2022. So up-to-date information in this presentation. So actually, we'll take a quick look at this video, which goes into, this is from CBS Sunday Morning a few years ago, that goes into the Shaker creation of furniture and the aesthetic that we know so well.
At the Hancock Shaker Village in far western Massachusetts, they have always kept things simple and clean. It's a museum now where visitors can see classic furniture designed centuries ago by the Shakers. The lines of the furniture are as clean as the rooms it inhabits. Leslie Hertzberg is the curator.
They weren't thinking of it as being beautiful, but they were thinking of it as being functional. That streamlined, simple, what we now say is beautiful design is a result.
They didn't mean for it to be beautiful?
They didn't. It's beautiful to our eyes, but they wouldn't have referred to it as beautiful.
These no-frills, no-flourishes chairs may be the best-known legacy of Shaker design. The Shakers came to the U.S. from England and established themselves as a Christian sect in the late 18th century. Their design style followed their lifestyle. It is simple and, above all, practical. This is a blanket chest made in the 1800s.
What's the thing on the bottom?
That is an extra drawer. The Shakers didn't like to waste space. And so if there was an additional way to use the space more efficiently, the Shakers would find it.
They were an innovative group that came up with new ways to solve old problems.
As is human nature, everyone wants to tip back in their chair. It's true.
It is true.
And so the Shakers did the same thing. But what the Shakers figured out was, in order to preserve the chair and also to preserve their floors, if you added this tiny little design element to the back posts of your chairs, you could preserve both that back post and your floor.
This is brilliant. So it swivels, if I may, it swivels with the chairs. You go back. This is brilliant.
Invented by the Shakers. And now seen on most classroom chairs for kids.
In their heyday in the 19th century, there were roughly 6,000 Shakers in nearly 24 communities from Maine to Kentucky. Their founder was a woman known as Mother Ann. They lived communally, so cleanliness became, if not next to godliness, at least really close.
Mother Ann once said there is no dirt in heaven. And so keeping your living quarters and your eating quarters and your work quarters clean was very important. And so that's why you have things like the Shaker built-ins, so you don't have to clean on top or beneath them.
In fact, a lot of Shaker design evolved from the necessity to tidy up. Among other things, they invented the flat broom.
And are the pegs, which you see in every Shaker thing, are they for hats or what?
They're for almost anything. So not only could you push your chair under the table, you could also hang it up on your peg.
And why would you do that?
Well, if you wanted to clean underneath it, but you would often hang it upside down so that dust wouldn't gather on the seat.
They brought this trestle from this lower, where it normally would have been in this lower position. They brought it up into this upper position.
Ian Ingersoll is a furniture maker in West Cornwall, Connecticut.
And they brought it up to that position so that they could clean under every table every day.
It's easier to get a mop under this
Easier
than
to
it
get
would
a
be
mop.
if there was a trestle
Yes.
cutting off half of the table.
Right.
Full disclosure here, Ingersoll is my neighbor.
These are the peg racks and the chair. And
He has spent decades studying and following Shaker design.
in the design world, we use the word to Shakerize, almost like it was a verb, meaning to simplify it to its simplest form.
Ingersoll makes Shaker furniture, but he also makes more contemporary pieces, frequently with a glance back at the Shakers.
And as a matter of fact, that aesthetic has really driven most of modern furniture design for the last 50 years.
The Shakers' designs have stood the test of time and influenced furniture makers of more recent times. But time might finally be catching up with them. Since the beginning, Shakers have been celibate, so new members can be hard to come by.
Mother Ann once said that once the number of Shakers dwindles to as many as you can count on one hand, that there will be a resurgence. And maybe that's still true.
Where once there were 6,000 Shakers, today there are just a handful living together in Maine. Perhaps the last of their kind.
So Shakers, there's actually two left now. They have a lot of influence within various artistic endeavors in the 20th century, particularly the mid-20th century. You see this aesthetic here in dance. This was a famous early to mid-century choreographer, Doris Humphrey, in the Dance of the Chosen from 1931. And she's using Shaker motifs here with the bonnets and the Shaker hats. And the most famous is Appalachian Spring, which was written by Aaron Copland in 1944. And it's a ballet, actually. And Martha Graham is the choreographer. And it's pretty interesting. So he weaves a lot of what are considered, American themes through it. One of the big ones being simple gifts. And so there's this amazing video from 1959 I'll just show a couple of minutes of Martha Graham is the female dancer in this, of a piece from Appalachian Spring done with simple gifts. know, I find this fascinating. This is over 60 years ago, and to me, it still seems very modern. But what's the first thing that would jump out at you is how this really isn't Shaker. You have men and women dancing together. You would never see that within a Shaker dance. So he's using this, theme, and then she's doing the riff on it. And this is kind of what you, not kind of, this is what you see in the mid 20th century as kind of Shaker gets exploded into the mainstream, and a lot of kind of the core concepts of the set kind of get left behind and focusing more on the aesthetic. And speaking of aesthetic, you have Charles Sheeler, which, if you're not familiar with him, he's a pretty fascinating mid-century American artist. He's I knew him as a photographer. Is how I first became aware of him. He's also quite a prominent painter, and I didn't know until I started researching this particular presentation. He also was a great collector of Shaker memorabilia, and so he also does these works on a Shaker theme here on the left, and then Shaker buildings here on the right. This one 1931, this one 1956, and he begins collecting Shaker items in the 1920s. The Demings Andrews starting collecting them around the same time, so he's really early on in the collection of Shaker memorabilia, and it's has a lot of influence on his work, and you'll see this in this. It's at the Metropolitan in New York. You'll see his work. If you go to a large museum, you go to the MFA, go to the Currier up in Manchester, obviously the Met in New York, I believe actually even at the Fogg, Harvard, you will find a Charles Sheeler, either a painting or a photograph. He's one of these guys that one of these days I may do a thing on him, but he's a pretty interesting artist, and he shows up a lot in these collections, and most major museums, certainly I'm aware of here in the East Coast, will have a Sheeler on display. And so this is what he considers entitles Americana, and you'll see here is one of the attributes or one of the representations of Americana is the Shaker oval box. And once again, this is 1931, right in the beginning of the Depression, and you're seeing this WPA, the Index of American Artifacts, beginning to take hold, and these things are really working their way into the language of American art. And as a quick aside, this is one of his most famous photographs. It's at the River Rouge plant in Ford Motor Company, 1927. He did a lot of his paintings and photographs of industrial. One of his, I believe his painting that's on display at the Currier is actually of the mills in Manchester, New Hampshire. So this is one of his subjects, and it's just amazing stuff, early century actually. So quickly to transition to museums, you have Pleasant Hill, Canterbury, and Hancock were the first three, and they happened in the 1960s. And each one kind of has a different spin. Hancock is more the Americana. Pleasant Hill kind of accentuates the agrarian, and within Canterbury, there are, I forget how many women, but there are a number of women still living there, and the last sisters. And there's a gentleman who becomes, there was an article about him, I think in Yankee Magazine just recently, where he was this radio DJ musician, and he kind of comes in the early 60s and pretty much says to them, you can make some money being a museum, and they become kind of museum pieces. People, and there's a book, there was a book, I think it's called Simple Gifts actually, that a woman wrote in the 80s or 90s about living up there with the Eldresses, sisters, and gleaning meanings of life from these women. I get the definition of spinster women. So that's kind of the turn that Canterbury takes. So these museums go on very different angles, and we'll take a quick spin through them. Hancock is famous for its round barn, which supposedly was designed by a wheelwright, and allows a lot of efficient moving of animal, basically moving in and moving out of animal products and waste. And once again, we're in the world of infrared, and these places are just, I was there in a morning a couple of summers ago, and I was kind of had the place to myself, and it was really a photographer's dream to be wandering around here. And once again, if you're into symmetry and things along those lines, it really lends itself to black and white. Shaker villages are amazing subjects. Enfield, as I mentioned, is where I took the class in the winter, and they're on a lake, Mascone Lake. It's about, 10 miles south of Hanover. And this is the hill. They had feasting hills where there was one in Harvard, and this is one up here in Enfield where they went later on and had religious services. And this one was very difficult for me because I'm very susceptible to poison ivy and I'm not a big fan of ticks. And I had to walk through about 4 feet of grass to get this shot, but I felt it was worth it because it's an amazing view over the lake with the village in the foreground. And like a lot of Shaker places, there was a question before about Tyringham, but a lot of them get absorbed into other things. One of them is prisons. Another one is religious schools, mainly Catholic. And so what you have right here is a chapel right in the middle that actually, I got a private tour of the place by Kyle when I was up here. And he mentioned, I thought this was still owned as a Catholic order up the road here, but this is actually owned now by the Shakers, and it kind of bums them out because it's concrete and it's deteriorating, which you're seeing a lot of buildings built mid-century are deteriorating in concrete, so they're kind of on the hook for this and they really don't use it. But unfortunately, a lot of the original buildings were taken down, and some of them even as recently as the 70s. This is the main building there in Enfield. It's the largest structure the Shakers ever built. It's called the Great Stone Dwelling. It is currently it's not a bed and breakfast, it's just a bed. I stayed here a couple of times and it's been through various iterations over the years. Bed and breakfast, it was closed down, now it's back. They host weddings up here, which I was kidding Kyle. I said, the people who have their weddings at a Shaker Shaker Village know about the Shakers. But when I was there back in the end of June, they were having a wedding there and people were staying here. And so you can actually stay here in this, and they have furnishings, not original furnishings, but they are Shaker replicas in the rooms. It's kind of a pretty nice place to stay. No air conditioning, steam heat. So when I stayed there in the winter, we had to open the windows because it was so hot. And you have a brothers and sisters entrance. So once again, everything's divided. So once again, you go into the symmetry. And I'm in another project with a photo group I'm a member of up in New Hampshire called the New Hampshire Society of Photographic Artists. And we're going through over the next year photographing 200-plus-year-old buildings within New Hampshire. So I asked my buddy Kyle what fits the bill up there in Enfield, and he showed me these and took me tours. Most of these are under restoration on the inside as well as the outside, but he gave me a hard hat view of these things, and they're in quite disrepair. But this one is, the outside has been finished, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And this one is, these are the brothers' workshops. That's the laundry. See how big this building is for the laundry, and this is the dairy. And those are the only 3 structures still remaining up in Enfield that are over 200 years old. So a lot of them were taken down in the 70s, which is kind of a bummer. And this is the mothership, Mount Lebanon, Shaker Village in New Lebanon, New York. Unfortunately, this one is not in great shape. It was absorbed by a private school called the Darrow School, Darrow Road there. And they kind of co-lease some of this stuff. And once again, you're going to have your remnant of a stone Shaker barn. This one is only the exterior is there. And they have it standing up, but you can see what a large edifice this was. And these are some of the buildings, and you can kind of get from this one some of the peeling paint. They're in disrepair. There is a bed and breakfast near there, Shaker Falls, which looks very nice. I haven't stayed there, but unfortunately, there's a barrel vault building here that I think is it's part of the Darrow School, and I didn't get a picture of it, but it's one of the unique architectural things within the Shaker villages, and it was built, a barrel vault roof was built, and the Darrow School still use it. And then the 2 in Maine are Alfred Shaker Museum here in Maine, which is kind of out here by Kennebunk. And then up here, the last remaining one, which is Sabbath Day Lake, which is north of Portland. And they're about an hour apart from each other. And the Alfred one, this was actually a mural that was commissioned by the Alfred Society there, the Historical Society. This is kind of how the village looked in its heyday. Once you can see the main street down here and the fields, and you had the village buildings on each side of the street. The only thing they have currently here is this is a Shaker building that was moved to this site, and this is the Alfred Historical Society, and they have Shaker exhibits inside. The actual village has been absorbed into a Christian school. And, as a Shaker enthusiast, I got a little bit bummed out because I can pretty much guarantee you that was not done by the Shakers. But some of these buildings are in disrepair. Some of them are better than others. And like I said, it's a Christian, I think, Catholic school there today. And once again, they had the communal burying ground. Here's just the one Shaker headstone. There's no individual headstones for the brothers and sisters. And there's this kind of random thing floating in a pond that was kind of a representation of what somebody thought was a Shaker barn with a disproportionate opening, but it's kind of interesting. And the Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village with Tom Cat. This is one of the few pictures that's not mine. My wife took this. Very, very friendly cat that roams around here. And this is the barn, which is undergoing restoration. And this is one of the rooms, which gives you kind of a it's very clean. This is more one of the accurate representations of how it might have been when a Shaker lived there, but you see the stuff hanging up. You see 3 beds, a little bit crowded. It's a communal society, and people talk. The question is like, well, it's a celibate society. How do things not happen? And one of the comments is, you're never by yourself. In this community, I would last for a lot of reasons, but I would last about 2 seconds in a Shaker village. But you have like no downtime to yourself. And so you're sharing rooms, you're eating meals together, you're working together. There's not a lot of alone time. And once again, a great subject for infrared photography. And this is the meeting house from, I believe, 1790. And this is the dwelling house, which is where the last 2 living Shakers live, off the main road here. This brick dwelling house, which is from, I think the original one burned. And so once again, if you see, I'm learning this, I'm doing this project up in New Hampshire. If you see a brick building, chances are about 90% that it's not 200 years old, because brick doesn't really come into prevalence until past like the 1830s. And so the original dwelling house burned and this one was built. And I want to say it was built in the 1830s or 1840s, but this is where Brother Arnold lives. And they have 2 different cemeteries, both of which are communal burying. And so to end with, I think nothing more apropos than I think a very, very resonant, simple gifts.
Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in that place just right, twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, and by turning we come round right. Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in that place just right, twill be in the valley of love and delight.
So 2 things about that song. One is I forgot to mention Alfred. It was written by a brother in Alfred, Joseph, I believe the name is Joseph Brackett, which you can't be in the Alfred Museum 10 seconds and not know that. And I was brought up Methodist, and if you're Methodist, you know that song as Lord of the Dance is the tune that we sang in church. So as I mentioned at the beginning, local library is an amazing source of information, and I would say pretty much most of these books I got from through the Chelmsford Library, through the Merrimack Valley Library Consortium. And so an amazing, amazing amount of information. I was thinking about the Shakers. There is no shortage of Shaker information. I will say there's a shortage of like one good book. You have to kind of get stuff from different books. The quote unquote, lack of a better term, the Bible of it is, I can't find it now. It was written by, Shakers in America, Stephen J. Stein, written in 1994. But I will say a couple of interesting books. One I found was really interesting called Utopia Drive, a road trip through America's radical idea. This guy he's a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he drives from Pleasantville out to here in Massachusetts and ends up in Niagara Falls and goes through all these, some current utopian communities, communes and stuff like that. A lot of them actually in Western Virginia. And then he goes to the Oneida community, which is the absolute antithesis of Shakers, and the fact the Oneida community was free love. It's a fascinating tour through all these things in American history, a lot of which I didn't know. So I would highly recommend that one. But all these books had really good information that I was able to glean at least something for this presentation. So with that, and the fact that the library is closing in 4 minutes, thanks everyone. And I would love, anybody has any questions or comments they want to pop into the chat or the Q&A?
Thanks for a really excellent presentation, Bruce. That was pretty fascinating. I don't think I knew that. I don't think I knew as much as I thought I did about the Shakers. So it was great. The furniture is so beautiful. I would love to just decorate my whole house in it. It's amazing.
Well, we have, so.
You have? Wow.
pretty
Oh,
much.
that's so cool. There is a question. While the Shaker aesthetic is elegant in its simplicity, my understanding is that it's complicated to do. Is that intentional?
I don't think so. It's complicated to us. They attracted a lot of good craftsmen. So they were, in their heyday, they were considered kind of a good place. Because, once again, in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, this is the homestead era and stuff like that. It's pretty tough living. And they had a thing called winter shakers, where people would become shakers for the winter because they had heat and food, and then they would leave. And the shakers were okay with that. But they were looking. They knew they needed tradesmen, and they definitely attracted tradesmen. And so, you could argue that quality of craftsmanship. The age-old adage is things were built better than they are today. You can always debate that, but back then they certainly were. Although Kyle will tell some stories. He goes, "I've seen plenty of shaker furniture that is not that great." It's like a lot of things. You see the good stuff, you don't see the stuff that wasn't quite aligned right, and
The
that
mistakes.
didn't survive 200 years. He goes, he's seen plenty of stuff that was not, made by Norm Abram of This Old House. But
That's great.
so, and I'm glad my high school compatriot was not aware that Albany was the hub of the Shaker community. And no, we did not talk about the Shakers in high school. That's for sure.
But it was all around you.
It was, but
really
it's kind of in the
interesting.
ether. It's just weird. Like I said, Shaker High School, one of my father's boss's sons went to Shaker High, and we played them in soccer, and I never thought really much about it. It was just like, oh, they're Shaker High, and we need to beat them, and their colors are blue and white. I never thought, why are they called Shaker High, and like, why is the town the school district named that? And there was we never went on field trips or anything. Nobody said, they never took us over to the Shaker museums over by the airport. But I will say, I'll give a shout to my parents. My parents did drag me to a lot of old houses, and I laugh now that I end up talking a lot about old houses.
Good. That's good
And
to hear that
photographing
your
them.
parents rub off on you eventually.
Yes, some good stuff, not all of it.
And then my husband is from the Albany area, and we lived there for a little while, and I remember Shaker High as being in that area because I worked for the Albany Public Library and knew all the different libraries in the area. But yeah, it's a really fascinating region. You do a great job of celebrating it.
Okay, well, I think I thought it was in this presentation, but I was, there we go. So moving east, the one I'm working on now is Island Lore, Shipwrecks, Mayhem, Lighthouses, and Photography off the New England coast. Stories from Thatcher Island, the Isles of Shoals, and Boone Island. The other thing, as a child, I spent my summers 5 weeks in York, Maine. So kind of my continuum with the Hudson River Valley all the way over to the eastern shores of New England. Hopefully I can do this in the winter, but I'm pretty much mostly complete with this. And I've visited these places on and off for years and have a lot of photographs. And there's some pretty fascinating stories that, once again, I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but a lot of crazy stuff happened off the coast of New England. So I will be delving into that at some point.
Fantastic. We look forward to it. Thank you very much. And I will share the recording for this presentation and all of the resources that Bruce had on that last slide there, and with links to the library if we have them. All right.
Great. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody, for
Have a
coming.
great night, everyone.